Yo, what's up guys? Today I'm going to be breaking down how I created this experimental composition using Adobe Premiere and Adobe After Effects in partnership with Adobe Stock and give you access to over 50 million videos with the unlimited plan. Before we start, for some context, my name is Jordan. I am a creative and a content creator from the UK, and I really love experimenting with all things motion and video. For today's video, we'll break it down into 3 sections: concept and composition, asset and assembly, finally editing. So jumping straight into the concept and composition side of things, the concept stems from the idea of paintings and more traditional kind of style paintings that had a lot of symmetry. I wanted to bring that with this element of kind of a central focal point, along with this sort of slightly more surreal floral approach. I wanted it to feel quite grungy and dark, so I knew I wanted something like dogs or lightning to kind of complement the composition and tap into that aesthetic. But I also really wanted to focus on using myself as an element within the composition and thinking about how I could replicate either takes of me within there or using parts of me, for example, like an arm or whatever, within the composition to really kind of bring in that surreal aspect. So the rough idea was a composition that looked a little bit like this. With that in mind, it was time for assets and assembly. So I started off by filming a few shots of me in slow motion in front of a blue screen. Then jumping into Adobe Premiere, I assembled the rough timeline stack, which in this case was simply having all of the clips at roughly the same length. Next, it was time for the additional assets from Adobe Stock. We'll head up to Window and select Adobe Stock, which opens up this extremely useful panel that's fully integrated into Premiere. We'll search for the assets we need. That's some dogs barking and lightning, as I mentioned before. And another great thing to mention is that with the unlimited plan, we can literally download as many assets as we need. Once downloaded, we can move them into our timelines, ready for editing in After Effects. You can move the assets from Premiere to Adobe by using a dynamic link composition or simply copy and pasting, whichever you prefer. But then it's time for my favorite bit, compositing. So over in After Effects, we'll start by keying out or rotoscoping our assets. We'll make sure our footage is slowed down. I shot this in 120 frames per second, so I can slow this down a fair bit. Now for the compositions. I created pre-comps for each of the layers, then positioned the assets to one side of the frame, with the center character being the middle line, so to speak. The assets we got from Adobe Stock are super useful as they have a green screen already in place, so we can simply key out the background with key light. We'll pre-comp the background assets and then duplicate and flip the pre-comp to make the mirrored look. I use a solid layer as a layer matte or mask to help create a smooth middle line. Next, we'll apply a LUT to give it a nice black and white look, and we are starting to cook. I added some grain and glow to give it a bit more of a grungy look. So at this point, I like the composition, but I felt like it was missing some depth. So that's when I decided to use a 3D camera to add a bit of Z space to the composition. Turning the layers of our background assets into 3D layers, I then tweaked the Z position of each element so that when the camera panned back and forth, you would get this parallax effect. For the background, I used a lightning asset from Adobe Stock that gave us this slightly surreal look. So at this point, I was really happy with the composition, but I felt like the middle part was missing something. During filming, I did some additional takes from the same seated position that I decided to then bring into After Effects to key out and add to our composition. Using Colorama, I created this negative style look and had it quickly cut between the 2 different takes. I added in an additional take of me facing forward towards the back of the composition to once again add a little bit more depth. I decided to duplicate a few more elements in the background, adding an invert effect to some of them, and I actually keyframed a bit of movement to each of the elements too. This really helped bring the composition to life and give it a little bit more subtle movement horizontally now that we had the depth movement in place. The final steps were adding some additional camera movement and a plugin I purchased to create this depth effect. Next, it was time to head over to Premiere for sound design. In Premiere, I used the Adobe Stock Panel again, this time to find some sounds that really brought the piece to life. I searched for sounds like dogs, lightning, and more ambient sounds like atmospheric drones and crunching noises. During this process, I used things like speed change, low pass filters, and pitch shift to tweak the sounds and match the movements. And there we have it, our final composition.